So now I think we are recording, so you may start, Katalin.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the third lecture of the new initiative of ICOS, Onomastics Online, the online lecture series that would like to provide students and researchers with state-of-the-art discussions on the topics related to the different aspects of proper names. With the lectures of the first semester, we would like to emphasize the interdisciplinary nature of dealing with names. That's why our first two speakers were from the fields of critical geography and spatial cognition. You can find those videos on ICOS website. And now we will approach names from another new perspective, the perspective of second language acquisition. Conventional onomastic research deals with the etymology of names, the linguistic strata in name corpora, the linguistic description and categorization of names. Besides that, socio-onomastics examines the way names are embedded into the social environment. To gain a comprehensive view of language and names as its elements, however, names also have to be examined as elements of the mental system, since language and thus also names are physically present in a person's brain. These problems are covered by the research scope of psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics. Therefore, onomastic research has to expand towards these scientific fields as well. These aspects are quite peripheral in name research, even though they can help to answer the questions whether names are part of the linguistic system or whether proper names have meaning, and if so, what kind of meaning they have, and so on. Today's lecture approaches names from a kind of applied linguistic, partly psycholinguistic approach that also have important consequences regarding the mental representation of names and even the questions of name theory. Kimberly Klassen is an English as a second language teacher and applied linguistics researcher who realized that names play a special role in teaching English for foreigners. Her research interests include second language reading and vocabulary acquisition, focusing especially on proper name processing. She has taught in Korea, Taiwan, the United Arab Emirates, and Japan, where she was an adjunct instructor in the English for Liberal Arts program at International Christian University, Tokyo. And now she is an associate professor at Tokyo Women's Christian University School of Arts and Sciences. She completed her PhD in applied linguistics, lexical studies at Cardiff University, Wales, on the lexical load of proper names for English as second language readers. I myself also teaches my mother tongue, Hungarian, for foreigners as a second language and have some interesting experiences related to how foreigners process Hungarian names. So I am very curious about this lecture and I am very happy that you accepted our invitation. And now the floor is yours, please, Kimberly.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction. So I'll start sharing my screen. Okay. How's that? That's okay. All right. Okay, so yes, so my name is Kimberly and I'm joining you from Tokyo. Which is maybe why this lecture is at a different time than the other ones. And as you heard in the introduction, I'm now at Tokyo Women's Christian University teaching second language acquisition. Before that, I've had lots of experience teaching English as a foreign language. And so I was so pleased to get this invite to talk for the Onomastics Online series, because in my own field of applied linguistics, proper names they haven't got a huge amount of attention or research done around them. So I was really pleased that I would be having an interested audience today. So thank you very much for that. So in today's talk, I'm going to start with I'll talk a little bit about my research and pedagogical context. specifically, I'm interested in vocabulary learning and how learners' vocabulary knowledge affects their reading comprehension. And so I'll talk a little bit about the research around proper names in that area. And then I'll give you some examples of difficulties that some of my own learners have had with proper names, because usually when I talk to researchers about this topic, they're kind of confused about, why would proper names be difficult? And so I'm going to share some real world examples with you about that. Classroom teachers, by the way, are never surprised. They're always like, yeah, of course, names are difficult, but researchers are a little bit more difficult to convince. Then I'll turn briefly to some theoretical perspectives, as was mentioned in the introduction. And I'll keep it brief, but yeah, we'll look at, there is a lot of debate around proper names, and then we'll specifically look at whether they represent lexical knowledge or world knowledge for the second language reader. And then I'll end the talk by giving a brief description of a replication study I did, just as an example of some of the research that I do. That one looked at proper names as an aspect of cultural or background knowledge and how it impacted reading comprehension. So starting a bit with my research context, as I said, I'm very interested in vocabulary learning and how that impacts reading comprehension. And there's an assumption in second language reading and vocabulary research that proper names are known. We can treat them as known, or at least very low burden items for second language readers. So some of the reasons given are that names probably have been learned in the first language. The initial capital letter on English proper names will indicate to the reader that the item is a name. And the context, the words around the name will help the reader, even if it's an unfamiliar name. And all that seems quite reasonable. And this assumption has led to a standard practice in the field where proper names are recategorized in lexical analyses as either known, like high frequency vocabulary, or even eliminating them altogether. So a lexical analysis is a way of looking at a text in terms of the vocabulary. So which words in the text are high frequency, very common, and which ones are low frequency. And this helps us determine, how difficult this particular text would be for a student, for example. And so when those analyses are done, there's always the problem what to do with the names, because as you know, names don't behave like other words. So what do we do with them? So, well, let's treat them as known, and then or take them out. And there are a few difficulties with that assumption. There's a few more implied assumptions built into that. So the first one is that the context is always going to be sufficient to reveal whatever necessary information the reader needs to know. And that's certainly not always the case. Another implied assumption is that second language readers are really skilled at using the context to infer the necessary information they need to know about unfamiliar names. And that might also not be the case. And then, of course, I think most people would agree that if we start eliminating proper names from these analyses, that kind of suggests that proper names don't contribute to text comprehension, which I don't think is the case. So those are some of the difficulties with that treatment of proper names by researchers. So why does it matter how proper names are handled in lexical analyses? Proper names can make up quite a significant portion of a text. So anywhere from 4 to 5% in in fiction, but there can be very proper name heavy texts where they make up to 9% of the text. So it's a lot of vocabulary that we're assuming is known or not creating a burden for the reader. Teachers use these lexical analysis tools. They're freely available online, and they use them to, gauge whether the material is suitable for their learners. So how researchers are encouraging teachers to use these tools and the treatment of proper names will have an effect in the classroom. And then we can also think about assessment writers. There's a lot of high stakes tests for well, not only the English language, many languages, but there's IELTS. People need these tests for jobs, to get into universities and so forth. And so that's something for test writers to consider as well, what the load of the proper names are for their test takers and whether we're unfairly burdening some readers versus others, for example. And then, of course, developers of learning materials, both for independent use and in the classroom, this is also something that they need to consider. Especially with English learning materials, they tend to be made for a very global audience. And so, names that are familiar in one context might not be in another. So there is no empirical support for the assumption that proper names are low burden items for second language readers. And as a teacher, I would definitely say that they are not low burden items. There was one study done, but that was done with second language listeners and proper names. Kovaleva, she created some news stories and she created proper names for her study, and to make sure that no one would know any of the names. And she had two conditions, names known and names unknown. So for the names known condition, they taught the participants these generated names. And then for the names unknown condition, they did not. They just simply played the news stories and the participants had to answer comprehension questions. So the detailed comprehension was better when the participants knew the names, had been pre-taught. In the names unknown condition, they were able to get less than half of the necessary information that they needed to know about these unfamiliar name reference from the context. So context was not very helpful for them. And they mistook unknown names for common nouns. So this was a study done with listeners, but it would definitely seem that there are implications for second language readers. So let's turn now to look at some examples that my own students have had with proper names, just to give you some idea of the difficulties that they can have. So this first example, I think, this was from when I was working in the United Arab Emirates. So the students' first language was Arabic. And extensive reading is something, maybe if you study a second language, you did extensive reading where you read simplified texts. So the texts, they might be like novels, but the texts have been simplified in terms of the vocabulary and the syntax, so that they provide the student with an opportunity to have an authentic reading experience. And by authentic, I mean that they don't have to jump to the dictionary every second sentence, that they can read continuously and understand what they're reading, just like they would in their first language. And these books have a lot of rich context and also pictures. I read these graded readers in Japanese, and there's a lot of, even for the intermediate level of reading, there's like lovely pictures in there that are especially put there to help the reader, and so that they don't have to go to the dictionary to get help. So they are meant for independent study, and the aim is to develop reading fluency, but you can also develop your vocabulary knowledge. because there might be like 1 or 2% of words that are unknown. So this is an opportunity to build vocabulary as well. So in the United Arab Emirates, I was doing this with low intermediate learners of English. And this was an activity they had to do at home. So they had to demonstrate to me something that they, had in fact done the reading. So I always asked them to give me a list of maybe 10 vocabulary items that they had learned from that particular book. And so this student who had been reading this book, on her list of 10 words, she had this item. So she's listed it as a noun. And so the first time I saw this, I thought, she was having me on a little bit or was having a joke, but she really did not understand that Jack was the boy in the story, and that he was the one who was climbing, and all the pictures didn't help her. And so I was like, well, maybe that was a one-off or something, but it started, tuning me into the difficulties that learners might have with proper names. And then shortly after that, I moved to Japan. And again, it's a situation with learners who are processing a different orthography than English. And so perhaps that's why I was noticing that with these particular learners. So this example here is from intensive reading. It was with the Japanese class intermediate level, so B1 on the Common European Framework of Reference. And this was an intensive reading. So this is a reading for a different purpose. It's to maybe teach some content or teach some ideas, or maybe introduce new vocabulary, for example. But because it's intensive, there will be more difficult syntax, and there will be a lot more unknown words, maybe up to 10% unknown. But that's where the teacher comes in to help the student. So this particular story was called The Climb of My Life. It was about a woman who was climbing a mountain despite the fact that she had a heart condition, and so therefore it was dangerous for her to do this. It was about taking risks. And it was a short text, 800 words, so an average text we would use in the classroom. And I'll let you read these sentences from the text. So Craig was the husband, and his name is mentioned 6 times in this short text. So his name appeared in almost every paragraph. And you can see sometimes his name appeared at the beginning of the sentence, and then other times it was mid-sentence. So if you look at these sentences, I think this is what, vocabulary researchers would say, look at this rich context. We have, my husband, Craig stayed, Craig surprised me. There's a lot of rich context here about Craig, even though you may have never heard this name before. And so, yeah, this seems like this would be, quite clear what Craig is. And I don't know if you know anything about Japanese classrooms, but they're most often, not always, but most often they are very, very quiet places where students really hesitate to ask questions. They're more familiar with listening to teachers. And but after we went through the text one time, I said, okay, was there any vocabulary questions other than our target vocabulary that we're going to be working on? And a student raised her hand and she said, what's a Craig? And I put the C in square brackets because I don't think for her, I don't think that C was capitalized. Like she didn't see it. I have the same problem with certain Japanese or katakana symbols, like, so I won't go into it, but I can see why she maybe didn't see that. And another student, whispered to her, oh, it's the husband. And she was terribly embarrassed and never asked another question all term. So that, another example of, difficulties that we might not predict unless we're actually in the classroom when it happens. Here's another example. I do teach undergraduate students, and I teach or I was teaching academic skills. So they need to know things like how to do academic citations. And so that can bring a whole bunch of other problems. So for example, understanding name order. In Japanese, family names come first and then the family name. And of course, that's different in English. It's the opposite. So you have to alert them to that all the time, reminding them the order. Also, just remember that they're trying to process all this quite difficult academic material in a different orthography. So there's a lot of text, and it's hard for them to like just quickly scan and identify names. For example, who's the author? Who's the publisher? These are all things that are a little bit more difficult for them because they're doing it in their second language. So as an activity I did just to raise awareness around this, this wasn't an English skills class, academic skills class. And I asked them several questions about this textbook, how it was set up, what kind of features it had, and so forth. And one of the questions I had them answer was, who are the authors? Can you find their names? And I know it's a little bit small on your screen. The authors' names are on the top right corner of the book. And so I've put them here so that you can see them more clearly. And so the first time I did this with a class, I think the class size was about 25. And about a third of the students had written on their sheets, they were working in pairs. About a third of the students answered that question, who are the authors? They answered it this way. And I was a little bit puzzled by this. I'm like, well, we've talked about, first names and family names. And then I think it's particular with American authors, maybe they like to use an initial, a middle initial. And so I was asking, why haven't you put the complete name? And so they explained to me, this is your cue to laugh. I know in Zoom, it's not very easy to laugh, but. So I understand there was some other things going on here. They weren't analyzing the intraletter components of the okay, thank you for the laugh there. Thank you. And I always mean to email these authors and tell them what fabulous names they have as authors of textbooks. Clearly the students were, thinking about, English class, we got grammar and vocabulary, and so they were keyed in that way. But still, I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? And I did repeat it with 2 more cohorts, and it happened again with about a third of the students. So it's not an isolated, incident. It's a difficulty that learners can have across cultural differences with names. And then just one more, because this is my most favorite example of difficulties. Again, this was a quite, pretty high level student. He was intermediate. He was writing a research paper over 1,000 words long. He was doing research. He had to have 10 sources for his topic. And I was checking his references list, and I came across this. So again, that's the cue to laugh. I just love this one because clearly he had been listening to me about inverting the family name and the first name to do the citation. But he just didn't know that AFP is not a person, it's a news agency. So he had extrapolated and done this. So yeah, that's my most favorite example. So a lot of thank you for smiley face. So a lot of different things going on here. there's certainly differences in reading experiences, both in the L1 and in the L2, I think maybe with Arabic reader. Certainly with all of those examples, differences in L1 and L2 orthography and writing systems. You might be thinking about, for example, German, which capitalizes not only proper names, but all nouns. So it's not just orthography, it's the writing system as well. Cultural differences in how names are presented. And then, yeah, learner experience with unfamiliar proper names. How much experience do they have with names outside, especially in an EFL context where they don't see English names. And then what I wasn't able to show you is some difficulties with phonological representations. If you can't pronounce a name, that makes it more difficult to keep the name in your working memory. And then that's going to overburden when you're trying to make sense of the text. And some interview studies I've done with students, they've talked about strategies, what they do when they come across a name that they can't pronounce. You know, it's like, oh, that's the A person and that's the D person, you know, and it can, yeah, burden the working memory. So those are some examples of problems that students can have. So then I thought I might do a little switch here and just look at the theory a little bit, because I know maybe many of you are linguists, so I don't want to go into this too deep, but just to look at this for what the theory might be saying about how L2 readers analyze names. So there is a lot of debate around proper names and a lot of different aspects of that debate, but I'll just limit it to these particular points as they might relate to second language reading. So as was mentioned in the introduction, do names have meaning, or are they part of the language system? And so should we consider them part of the second language reader's lexical knowledge or encyclopedic or world knowledge? So all things in linguistics tend to come from all things in philosophy. So we'll start with some philosophical perspectives on names. So the first major position came from John Stuart Mills, who talked about reference, so that proper names refer, but they don't indicate attributes about their reference. And the terms there, denote and connote, are, he's using those terms philosophically. So his famous analogy was from the robber in the Arabian Nights. He said that just like the chalk marks that the robber put on the houses, proper names are like the chalk marks. They only serve to distinguish, but they don't have any meaning, and they don't say anything about the house. So they just refer and they don't. So a quite strong Millian stance then would be Strawson, for example, who said names have no meaning and therefore they're not part of language. That's a very strong Millian perspective. So then the other major perspective on names came from Gottlob Frege, which has been called sense in English. So he was writing in German. So he said, in addition to Bedeutung, proper names have Sinn, sense, which might be glossed as associative meaning. So his famous example was the morning star is the evening star, where the referent is the same, but there's a different sense in those two names. Despite his concept of sense, John Lyons would say that he summarized that the widely held philosophical view is that proper names have reference, but no sense. So that's kind of the where most people are. So then let's go to the linguistic perspectives. So those that have a Millian view of proper names. If you have a Millian view, you would say that there's no lexical meaning, that they only contain encyclopedic information. And so this description that follows is from John Anderson. He doesn't agree with this conceptualization, but this is his explanation of it. So I should say that it comes from him. So he said, you have this lexical entry for a name, and that connects to the concept of the referent. And that concept is going to provide access to encyclopedic information for that referent. And therefore the name is part of the concept, but it's not part of the linguistic system. So that's kind of this perspective that there is no lexical meaning. And so the next speaker in this series is Richard Coates, which I'm really excited to see his talk. He would say, you know, if there is a meaning, the meaning is the reference. So that's how we can look at that. So that's the Millian view of proper names. There are some linguists that have tried to interpret Frege's sense. So I'm going to run through a few of those then. So the first one is Allerton, who glossed Frege's sense as language internal semantic relations. And so what is that? What is that? So names have meaning. He said that they contribute to the meaning of the sentence, but that meaning is isolated from the other words and grammar, so it's unintegrated. And he said, in that way, names seem to exist both inside and outside the lexicon. And I like that because it really highlights the difficulty that we have classifying names. Another interpretation of sense comes from John Anderson. He talks about sense relations. He says this is lexical knowledge, and he says that's distinct from encyclopedic knowledge, which would be your belief about the referent. So as an example, he says the name Bertie. So I think he was referring to Bertie Wooster. He says the sense, so the lexical knowledge you have about that name is human and male. They're very, very minimal, but human and male. And then anything else you know about Bertie Wooster, it would be encyclopedic information. So he maintains that this is minimal, but he still says it's lexical, it's not encyclopedic. He says for that reason, names are part of the language system. And he gives the example of the medieval scholars who would Latinize their first language names. And he said, can there be any sure sign belonging to a particular language? So I like that. The last gloss of Frege's sense comes from Van Langendock, which he glossed it as meaningfulness. So he said proper names are words just as others. And he said, you know, if we have difficulty with that, we could say proper names have associative meaning while common nouns have conventional meaning. He provides very interesting neurolinguistic support for this idea. He was reporting research done by a German psychologist, Joseph Bayer. So this was in German, so I've not read the original, but so I'm relying on Van Langendock. So the research Joseph Bayer did was with a patient who had deep dyslexia. That means she could only access words through the semantic route, not through the phonological route. So you could show the patient words, so she couldn't read them, but she understood them. She couldn't say them. So they showed her names, and she couldn't read them, but she could provide categorical information about them. For example, when they showed her male and female names, she could usually say whether it was a man or a woman. For example, they showed her the name Australia, and she said country, which Bayer categorized as a category. And then she also said far away and kangaroos, which he said was connotations. So Joseph Bayer concluded there must be some minimal lexical categorical sense in the semantic memory with names, and I find that really interesting. So does Van Langenbach. So he has these, he talks about presuppositional meaning, and so some different types here. So categorical, and maybe as I go through this list, you can think about, you know, the information that a second language reader might not be privy to. So categorical, do they always understand when it's a man or a woman or a place name? Is it a lake or is it a city? Associations, like the phonological shape of names, whether they sound feminine or masculine, connotations around names, emotive, and grammatical. So I think these are things that, yeah, I would not assume that my second language learners would know about all the proper names that they encounter. Last point about the theory, I do want to touch very briefly on lexicography for a few reasons, because we are talking about words, but also because for the second language reader, the dictionary is a source of, you know, guidance and help, maybe for researchers too. So Shcherba was a Russian lexicographer that I learned about through Patrick Hanks. And he said in his theory about lexicography, he said names must have meaning because they are used in speech. And he maintained that this meaning is not encyclopedic, and that the task for the lexicographer then would be to define that necessary minimum information that would be needed to understand a proper name. So I think that necessary minimum connects nicely back to John Anderson's necessary minimum. So he gave a few examples. So he said, for example, if you had Australia, you could say, you know, it's one of the countries of the world. That's all you would need to know to understand that name. Louis XIV, one of the French kings. So you get the culture and the role there that you would need to know to make sense of this person in this text. And he said, of course, you know, it's not possible to include all proper names. That would be impossible, but just those that are common to a linguistic group. And so that brings me back to then Patrick Hanks. He talks about dictionaries that exclude proper names are working under the assumption that words denote classes, whereas dictionaries that include proper names, which would be many learner dictionaries, they are working on the assumption that words include all items of a shared cultural knowledge. And he writes about how this cultural knowledge is frequently exploited. And so if you're not privy to that information, then, or that shared cultural knowledge, then it might be more difficult for you. So this was an example that he saw in a newspaper headline, a blind Sherlock Holmes, to refer to detective. And there's a nice quote there from him that I'll let you read. Okay, so let's go back to the second language reader. As I've mentioned a few times, there is very limited research on how second language readers respond to proper names. John Lyons, he did allow that the distinction between proper names and common nouns might not always be clear cut for language learners. He gives an example, like if you're reading about Horace, this character Horace, for the first time you're coming across that name. And then from that experience you think that all people named Horace have certain qualities, like that original meeting you had with that name. You might want to think whether you have that own experience from your own reading, but that, you know, a possibility. And then I would certainly say that I think L2 readers analyze proper names differently than vocabulary researchers do, which is how I became interested in this topic. So then at the end of my talk here, I'm coming to the end. I'm just going to briefly talk about one example of a study that I did. This one looked at proper names as cultural knowledge. we tried to do more replication work in applied linguistics. And so this was an approximate replication of Erdmann and Razzi. And I should say that in their original study, they weren't interested in proper names at all. They were looking at the effects of cultural familiarity and how that impacts second language reading. And this is well supported by the research that if you have shared cultural knowledge, that is going to help your reading comprehension. So their question was, they had two research questions. So does familiarity with cultural content of short stories affect reading comprehension? And so this is what they were looking at. If you don't have that shared cultural knowledge, could reading activities like done in the classroom before, during, and after reading, could those make up for a lack of cultural knowledge? So that's what they were interested in. So their study was done in Turkey with quite advanced learners of English. They were studying to be English teachers. They used this short story. It was about 3,000 words, I think. And so they had the original version of the story in English, and then they made an adjusted version. And in the adjusted version, they changed the characters' names to Turkish. So the story was still in English, but they changed the characters' names to Turkish. And in the story, if you're not familiar with this story, it's kind of a famous story, but the characters walk through New York as they're having this argument. And so they changed the place names from New York to Kanakal, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, a coastal city in Turkey that their students were familiar with. And there were a few conceptual cues that were changed. For example, they drink raki instead of wine. So I was really, really interested in this story or in this study because so much of what they changed was the proper names, the place names, the people. So I thought, yeah, this is what I need to do. So they had 4 treatments. So in group 1 read the original American story in English with no reading activities. And the second group read the original version, but this time with reading activities like, those very things that teachers do to generate background knowledge and things. And then they had a group read the adjusted version with the Turkish names, but no reading activities. And then the last group read the adjusted version with reading activities. And then they did a comprehension recall test. So that meant that the learners could not look back at the story. They had to just do it from what they remembered. And here are their results. So in the mean column, Erdmann and Razzi didn't use raw scores. They converted it to percentages. So what you see in the mean column is the comprehension percentages. So you can see that the group that read the original story, they had an average comprehension of about 60%, which isn't so great. We would kind of hope for around 70%. That would be kind of a good score for a reading test like this. You can see that the group that read the adjusted version without reading activities, they got 70%. So that's a nice level. And then the last group, they got 80%, which is really high. And I didn't want to bog you down with the stats, but they did report effect sizes, and the effect sizes were really large. I think between the first group and the last group, the co-NSD was like 1.16, very large effect size. So I thought, great, this is what I want to do. So just to summarize the original story just very quickly, there was an effect of cultural familiarity on reading comprehension, and that the reading activities were helpful, but they didn't make up for a lack of cultural knowledge. So I did this study, it was a replication, so I changed 2 major variables. The first major variable was the L1 background of the readers. So in my study, the participants were Japanese. The other major variable that was changed was the second language proficiency. My participants had an intermediate level versus the advanced in the original study. Everything else was followed as closely as possible. The original text was used, the same reading activities were used, and the same comprehension test was used. I also created an adjusted version of the text, so this time using Japanese character names. And I used the Japanese city of Osaka because that's the city that my participants were familiar with. And we changed cultural cues as well. For example, they drank beer instead of wine. So just to give you an idea what this looks like. So here's the first couple of sentences from the original text. I'll let you read that. And here's the Japanese version. So maybe already you're feeling maybe a little bit more challenged with the Japanese version, I don't know. Okay, so here are the comparison of the results. So I've put the original study results in the middle column there so that you can refer to them. And then the results from my study are on the far right. And the first thing you notice from my results is that my students' comprehension was much, much lower. And in fact, the group that should have done the best, that read the adjusted version with reading activities, they should have done the best and they actually did the worst. So, so what's going on? Yeah, what's going on? So post hoc analysis, going back to the variables that I changed. So looking at the L1 background of the participants, the Turkish readers may have had an orthographic processing advantage. Turkish uses a Roman script, which is the same script as English. So, but of course the Japanese were using a different script. And the proficiency. So second language texts are more comprehensible when most of the vocabulary is known. I don't know if that's, maybe that's not obvious, but it's true. And there's a wonderful study done by Schmidt, Zhang, and Grave, where they found that for background knowledge to have a helpful impact on comprehension, at least 94% of the words in a text need to be known. That's quite a high percentage. If there's less than 94%, your background knowledge just isn't going to help your reading comprehension. And I think that's where the difficulty lay. I had done vocabulary testing with these groups to ascertain their vocabulary knowledge, which words they knew. And I extrapolated that they knew about 90% of the words in this text. So they were lower proficiency and the text was just too difficult. So even though they had the cultural support with the Japanese names, it just wasn't enough to help their reading comprehension. So I concluded that yes, cultural knowledge does help reading comprehension. It's certainly true. It's well supported in the research. But if you don't know enough vocabulary in the text, it's just not going to be enough to support you. And there is, it's very difficult to tease apart how cultural knowledge is being used by the reader, whether it's operating at a higher level reading processing level, like on their world knowledge, or is it at the lexical level, like word recognition. So my study's findings didn't add anything to that mystery. So I am coming to the end here. Future directions, I'm very interested in looking at orthographic processing of proper names. For example, whether the initial capital letter on English proper names facilitates name recognition. If you remember that example of Craig, I would like to look at that to see whether it does. There has been studies with Italian L1 users, Parasotti and colleagues, and they found that yes, proper names are recognized faster with a capital letter. So I would like to investigate that with second language readers. And then that brings me to the end. I just thought I'd finish with a quote from Patrick Hanks, the lexicographer. because this is relevant to everyone here today, I think. So in some of the large lexical databases, and really large, they're aiming at full coverage of a language. Over 70% of the lexical entries already are proper names, and this percentage continues to grow. So in other words, the number of proper names is both larger than the rest of the lexicon and is growing faster than any other area of the lexicon. The nearest rival is multi-word expressions, which is really another very popular area that's being researched. So I thought that gives everyone here lots of research opportunity, but it also indicates that, you know, our learners are going to be encountering unknown vocabulary, proper names. And so, yeah, okay, so thank you for listening. And I thought, you know, we could have some time for questions, and maybe if you wanted to share some of your experience with unfamiliar proper names when reading, that would be great. And here are some of the references. 2 slides. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kimberly. It was really exciting. And now, yes, as you mentioned, we have some time for questions and comments. And while we are waiting for the questions, I just would like to tell one of my experiences that is partly similar to your examples. We have Chinese students here in Debrecen who learn Hungarian as their major. So after 3 years of intensive language learning, they study literature and linguistics in Hungarian. And even though unknown names could cause problems for them, unknown Hungarian names, in one morphology test, based on their knowledge that the ending of infinitive is ni in Hungarian, some of them analyzed the female name Fanny with a capitalized letter also as an infinitive form with an unknown verb stem. Of course, the name doesn't have anything to do with this kind of explanation, but they just analyze the name in this way. And yeah, so names can cause problems even for those who are speaking the foreign language quite high level.
That brings to mind some research with word recognition and quite advanced Chinese readers of English, and the researchers were looking at how well they could infer the meaning of the unknown words. And because they are, I mean, there's a lot going on, but when they are reading and they make a mistake, like with a very similar looking word, like optical and optional, for example, they just go with the initial one, and even they report that they're using context to infer meaning, but in fact they're not, and they're making the errors, you know, at that intraletter word, you know, analyzing. So yeah, it's, you know, it just brought to mind that example. Thank you. So Ava, is it Ava or Eva?
Yes, Eva, thank you so much. It was very interesting. And I also teach the Hungarian language for foreign students, and I can see that unknown proper names could cause problems for them. The initial capital letters could help to recognize the proper names, but they have no more pieces of information about the names in the text sometimes. In the Hungarian language, there is no gender differences, so they sometimes don't know if it is a female or a male name, especially if the name has other and different orthography than other languages. So I think it's a very interesting topic, and proper names need a special attention. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So no gender differences. Yeah, that's interesting. And I often ask my students to guess, you know, when we're doing academic citations and they need to report on the author, you know, just take a guess. You have 50% chance of being right. But just you know, training them to listen for that sound of English names, like the names that sound more feminine, like Kimmy, Nancy, Tracy. Yeah, but even with L1 students, I think it was Nagy and Anderson, they analyzed textbooks for first language children in America, and they analyzed the texts, and they found so many instances of where, you know, new proper names like rivers or countries was being introduced to these children, but it wasn't, you know, there wasn't enough context for the children to understand what it was referring to. And they had a conservative estimate, I think, of 1,000 proper names that, you know, these young children would have to be taught in their first language. So it's, yeah, certainly not just for, and yeah, so often there isn't enough context around the name.
Yeah.
You know. Sorry, so Tamas, is it Tamas? Now I'm practicing my unfamiliar names. There's so many unusual names here today.
Yes, thank you. My remark is concerning the importance of this topic to the translation studies. The everyday translators were the learners of the second of another language as a second language. If they were good or not at it, it can cause different different results. This problem is to identify a lexical unit as a proper name, if it is understood as a proper name or a common word. For example, a sentence in a movie that, where the sentence is "Chivalry is not dead," which is a unit in this form. But if chivalry remains as chivalry in English, and the rest of the sentence is translated, which happened in a movie once, it causes, if chivalry is a person who is not dead, which is impossible for the meaning of the story, and it can happen. But also it occurs that a proper name is understood in another way, to be mistaken for another kind of proper name. For example, when it is written in online media that Svenska Dagbladet wrote that, and if the writer of the article thinks that he is a person, let's say a man, and not a newspaper in Sweden, then the text will be inappropriate and will be false for the Hungarian readers of that. And what comes in connection to the language learners, I also had Chinese students learning Hungarian in Budapest or at a university. And one problem, if they are familiar with the name stock of the Hungarian language which they are learning. But another question can come if they should have to speak about the Chinese history or literature or culture or geography, and when they do not know the Hungarian equivalents for their name stock. That's also an important and interesting question, and it could turn out for me in the second or third year when they were studying the language, that they do not know the Hungarian equivalent for the Chinese names, which they should know, and that's also an interesting factor in this field, I think. So I really like the presentation and its consequences also for the name theory. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that your comment about the translation brought to mind, yeah, the issue of metonymy. So that's like the machine translations, they get stumped by proper names all the time. Like, so Birmingham beats Manchester on the machines, like, what is this referring to? So I love your example of chivalry is not dead. So this is a person. So I got that one. Thank you. That's great. Was there another question from, oh, Carol, that's a familiar name to me, Carol.
Hello, yes, and thank you for a really excellent lecture. That was very interesting indeed. We also have a large cohort of non-native speaking students, and suddenly I understand some of the mistakes that turn up in essay bibliographies. Thank you for explaining that. My question really follows on from Tamish's. How important or otherwise do you think it is for learners to become familiar with the common name stock of the second language? What I'm thinking is that the adjusted versions in your study and the study by Ayrton and Razzi may help with comprehension of the passage, but at the same time, they remove the names themselves that may also be useful for learners to be aware of. So what I mean is that if the names are changed, the learners are never going to find out that Jack and Craig are common boys' names in English-speaking culture. So I'm wondering if, is there an extent to which that defeats the object?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I should have, because I have presented on that study at a conference and for language teachers, and the questions were, they were all very excited about doing this in their classes. And I said, oh no, I actually don't want people to do that. I don't think that's a good idea. Like you said, you're robbing them of opportunities to come across new names. No, yeah, no, I was looking, that wasn't the reason for that study. I think we're doing students a disservice. There are a lot of, for example, in those graded readers, there is some acknowledgement about the load that names can be for readers. And so on the first page, they'll have like little pictures of all the characters. Because some of these like simplified Jane Austen novels, and they have a lot of different characters and they're all introduced in the first chapter. And so it's a lot to remember. And so they have pictures and then with the names. And so, yeah, no, I think it's really important that they become familiar with that, with at least the common names. They're not going to, just names are ephemeral and names are always being created, every day.
Yes, I could see from that quotation that you put up from Patrick Hanks towards the end that, yes, I mean, that's such a strong argument that you cannot possibly become familiar with all the names, but so that is an argument against that. But yes, the really common ones.
Yeah, and some strategies, just like I mentioned, like listening for some sounds in English to help determine whether it might be, I mean, there's no hard fast rules, but even like Adam and Adams. So one is a first name and one is, so teaching them little clues like that, Vil and the O, like O'Hara. It's just these little clues that can tell them a little bit about whether it's a person or a place or, yeah, just some strategy and just as they come up maybe, but certainly when I was teaching reading strategies, we would spend a little bit of time on this because they're gonna come up with names all the time, and yeah, so yeah, thanks for bringing that point up. I don't want people going around changing the names in their texts to match.
Really interesting though. Thank you. It's so good to get that perspective from the classroom. Thank you.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, just looking at all these interesting names on the screen, I'm thinking they're all very different names for me.
Yeah, and from different countries. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I can't see any raised hands. I'm just wondering that even the other way of language processing could be interesting. I mean, so is there any research, or are you planning, maybe you referred to that you are learning Japanese, are you planning the study to reveal how European language speakers learn names in a language with another writing system, for example, in Chinese or Japanese?
Yes, that, yeah, just got to get around to that. There actually was I think there was Uden and Schmidt. One of the studies where they actually eliminated the proper names from their lexical analysis. I think that was done with Polish readers of English. And the authors argued that because Polish has a similar orthography treatment of names, and I don't know, but they said, therefore, we can assume that these names are known and they won't be difficult. And I was quite surprised. So yeah, no, I would very much like to do work with European languages and look at that more. People often mention to me German, that you know, that German capitalizes all nouns, and what kind of you know, what kind of effect that has on their processing of names. And then of course in English, when we compare English to European languages like French and Spanish, languages like French and Spanish don't capitalize days of the week and months of the year, but in English we do. I think it was Strawson who called them these words that grow capital letters, because they're not really proper names, and so there's a lot of arguments about what are proper names. But so that's interesting, because in those different European languages like French and Spanish and Italian, those certain items would not be capitalized, but they are in English. And I think people in who are first speakers of English might analyze those items as names. But I haven't done any work in this, but it's certainly something to look at, I think. Yes. So maybe some research opportunities with my new friends at ICOS.
Yes.
Historically in English, names weren't capitalized. So, you know, when we look back through the history of English, it can be difficult to tell sometimes what is intended as a name and what isn't. I think John Anderson in the book he mentioned takes an even broader approach. I think he counts some things as names which aren't capitalized. I'd need to check that. But I'm almost sure that's right.
Yeah.
So yes, there's some real ambiguity.
Yeah, I think he said, for example, names of languages. No, sorry. Yeah, he treated names of languages as proper names, but names of nationality as not, because of how they operate as predicates of the sentence. So I'd have to check.
Yeah, but indeed. But it's it's a fascinating area.
Yeah, there's a lot of disagreement about what is a proper name.
Isn't there just?
So I'm really looking forward to Professor Coates' talk next month, which I will be watching on YouTube after it's uploaded.
Yes, thank you. And if there is no raised hand, then thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I think this lecture demonstrated convincingly that proper names need a special attention, even within those areas that traditionally consider names as one of the simplest parts of language that has basically nothing to do with. And for me, this lecture also reassured the importance of online dictionaries and including names, or online sources in general for language learners. And so thank you once again. And finally, I would like to remember everyone, as you did, that our next lecturer is going to be Richard Coates, who is going to talk about the pragmatic theory of properhood on the 18th of May. Thank you.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks for everyone's comments. That was great. I really enjoyed it. It was great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. See you in Helsinki next year.